existence from matter. I am proposing, based on my Vedic inspiration, that a human being is composed of matter, mind, and consciousness. But mind and consciousness, instead of being produced by matter, have their own independent existence, especially the conscious self. And there is some evidence that supports the idea that the conscious self can exist apart from matter, apart from the brain. One category of such evidence is medical studies of out-of-body experiences. You know, there are times when a person should be completely unconscious. For example, during a heart attack, the heart stops beating, blood stops flowing to the brain. Medical instruments show that the brain waves stop in many cases. And in a condition like that, a person should be completely unconscious, yet many people in that condition report separating from their bodies, and they look down and they see and hear what the doctors and nurses are doing to revive them. So many physicians have heard such accounts from cardiac arrest patients, and some of them, like Dr. Michael Sabin, have wondered, are these people telling the truth, or are they just making up some kind of story? So Dr. Sabin decided to do a study. He selected about a couple of dozen cardiac arrest patients who had reported these out-of-body experiences. He interviewed them very carefully and asked them to recall every detail of what they could remember the doctors and nurses were doing to revive them. Then he compared the accounts from the patients to the medical records kept by the doctors and nurses who had treated them. And these records were not available to the patients, and he found that the descriptions matched. So he concluded that the reports were genuine. So it appeared to him in these cases that the conscious self temporarily separated from the brain and then re-entered the same body, the same brain. And that leads to another idea, namely that a conscious self could leave one body, physical embodiment, and take on another physical embodiment. Of course, that's the concept of transmigration of the conscious self or soul, reincarnation, in other words. And there is a body of scientifically reported evidence that supports that idea. One such category of evidence is psychiatric studies of past life memories. The late Dr. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia Medical School and his colleagues studied thousands of cases of past life memories reported by young children. And in over 800 of these cases, they were able to verify the existence of the person the child claimed to have been in the past life. So what I proposed in my book, Human Devolution, is that we begin our existence on what I call the level of pure consciousness, where we exist in harmony with all other conscious beings and the source of all conscious beings. If a conscious self becomes egotistical or selfish, it can no longer exist in that harmonious state. So it would come down to other levels where it would be covered by the subtle mental energies and additionally the gross physical elements. And those coverings are what we call bodies. So what I was proposing is that as conscious beings, we don't evolve up from matter, as many scientists now believe. Rather, we devolve or come down from that level of pure consciousness. And it's a process that can be reversed. We have an original form of pure consciousness called in Sanskrit a swarupa, original form. It can become covered by the lower energies of mind and matter, but it's a process that can be reversed and consciousness can be restored to its original pure state. And that is, the purpose of different systems of yoga, meditation, contemplation, and prayer that can be found in the world's different wisdom traditions. Personally, I have been a practitioner of Bhakti Yoga for over 40 years, and one of the principal practices of consciousness purification in Bhakti Yoga is the chanting and meditation upon chanting of and meditation upon mantras like the Hare Krishna mantra, which I've been doing for 40 years. So this book, My Science, My Religion, contains 4 papers that I presented on a Vedic conception of consciousness. I presented papers on a Vedic consciousness-based alternative to the materialistic ideas of how we have evolved as to become conscious beings. Principally, these papers were presented at a conference called Tour de Science of Consciousness that's held every couple of years. So I've also applied some of my Vedic inspiration to the understanding of the causes of our environmental crisis. And we all know there are some tremendous problems going on in the world today, like the deforestation of our planet, the desertification of our planet, the ongoing problem of air pollution and water pollution. And in this book, Divine Nature, I presented a Vedic perspective on the environmental crisis. The root of it is explained in, I believe, in the Bhagavad Gita. 5,000 years ago, Lord Krishna said to his friend and disciple Arjuna, as recorded in the Gita, he explained a certain kind of philosophy. It's a very materialistic philosophy, the supporters of which, Krishna said, say that this world is unreal with no foundation, no God in control. It's simply matter combining according to its own accidental laws. And in that same 16th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna explained that such a philosophy leads to a very materialistic culture. The followers of this philosophy believe that to gratify the senses is the prime necessity of human civilization. Thus, until the end of their life, their anxiety is immeasurable. And then Krishna went on to say in the Gita that such people will engage in unbeneficial, horrible acts meant to destroy the world. So I think this pattern is visible today. In the world today, a materialistic cosmology is very dominant in the education systems. We're told we are machines made of molecules that have come about by accident. We're told that consciousness is just brain chemistry. So it's not very surprising that a whole worldwide human civilization has developed an extremely materialistic culture, whereby most people think that to produce and consume more and more material things is the main purpose of human existence. And in the process of that ever-increasing cycle of overproduction and overconsumption, we have manifested environmentally destructive behaviors and technologies. So if that's going to change, I think we have to go right back to the root. We have to come up with a fundamentally different understanding of who and what we are as conscious beings. We're not just robot-like machines made of molecules in competition with each other for survival. So in the book, I, along with my co-author Mukunda Goswami, put forward a 5-point program for environmental preservation and renewal. First, a new science that recognizes God and the soul. 2, religious practices that give non-material satisfaction, because the real solution to the world's environmental crisis is that we have to voluntarily decrease this tendency to overproduce and overconsume. And people are only going to be able to do that, voluntarily adopt a more simple way of life, if they have some kind of inner satisfaction, which can be developed. Third point is respect for all living things. Even the trees are living things. They shouldn't be unnecessarily cut down. Fourth, an eco-friendly spiritual vegetarian diet. There have been a lot of studies showing that a vegetarian diet consumes less scarce resources than a meat-centered diet. And a sustainable economic system founded on small cities and self-sufficient villages. So this book, My Science, My Religion, contains a paper I presented on this topic at a major international conference on the environment. Another question that I deal with is, when did archaeology begin in India? According to most scholars today, archaeology began in India in the 17th century, when European travelers began exploring and writing about their encounters with ancient temples and things like that. And even Indian archaeologists believe that. For example, Chakravarti, Dilip Chakravarti, wrote in his History of Indian Archaeology, without doubt, these records, these European traveler accounts, are the first group of archaeological writings on India. Now, what I've shown in my work is that India had its own independent archaeological tradition, if we understand archaeology in a broad sense to include all human engagement with the physical remains of the past. For example, there are accounts in the Indian literature, such as the Chaitanya Charitamrita, about excavating ancient artifacts. For example, there's the story of how an Indian saint named Madhavendra Puri excavated a lost sacred image, a deity form of Krishna called Gopal in Vrindavan in the late 15th century. So he actually learned about the location of the image in a dream. He got some villagers together and they excavated at the spot revealed in the dream, and they encountered this lost sacred image. So to me, that's a kind of archaeology, excavating and finding physical remains from the past. And there are accounts of this, from a time preceding the 17th century European travelers' accounts. There's also the account of the Indian avatar and saint Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who excavated deities of Krishna and the associated persons Nanda and Yashoda in a cave in Vrindavan early in the 16th century. So my point there is that India had its own independent archaeological tradition, independent from the European travelers and colonizers. In the early 16th century, an Indian saint named Rupa Goswami excavated a lost deity of Govinda, a form of Krishna, again in the Vrindavan area. So I've presented papers on this topic at meetings of the European Association of South Asian Archaeologists, including one that was held at the British Museum in London. And I presented a paper on this topic at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress in Osaka, Japan. And one of those papers, a revised version of one of those papers, was later published in Antiquity, which is one of the main journals in archaeology. So this book, My Science, My Religion, contains 4 papers that I've presented on this indigenous Indian archaeological tradition. So the reason I'm doing this is because my Guru said, if you want to understand this Krishna consciousness on the basis of philosophy, logic, and science, we are prepared to present it to you. So he wanted presentations to the academic and scientific world that integrated spirituality and science, and that's what I've been doing in my work for the past 30 years, and some of the results of it are found in this latest book of mine, My Science, My Religion, which contains an introductory essay about how and why I've decided to integrate my religious inspiration with scientific research, and if you want to see exactly how I do that in particular venues, then you could consult the papers in the book, some of which have been published elsewhere in different academic and scientific publications. And these are some of my other works. The Forbidden Archaeologist, which is a collection of columns that I've written for a magazine called Atlantis Rising, and then Forbidden Archaeology, which is about 900 pages long. There's The Hidden History of the Human Race, which is an abridged version of Forbidden Archaeology. And this is some of my contact information. And for those of you who might be interested, in June of 2015, I'm a speaker on Spirit of Alaska cruise, and there'll be a lot of other speakers there. I'm going to be speaking particularly about comparing the Vedic cosmology of ancient India with the cosmology of the Tlingit Indian people of the Northwest United States, Alaska, Canada. So, thank you for coming to hear something about my science, my religion. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
When the Homo Floresiensis incident and discovery and the verification that it did seem to be Homo erectus, how did that fit in with your Puranic sources as to this late discovery of a very early form of a hominid?
Okay. For those of you who may not be familiar with the reference, in Indonesia, one of the islands is called Flores Island, and there have been many interesting archaeological discoveries made on Flores Island. Now, in terms of my Vedic inspiration from the Puranas, the basic picture that emerges in the Puranas is one of coexistence of humans like us with more apparently primitive ape-like humanoid creatures. There are actual descriptions of this in the Puranas and other Vedic texts like Ramayana, Mahabharata. There were creatures called Vanaras who had ape-like bodies and a human-like intelligence and a low level of human type of culture. So the picture that we get is one of coexistence of humans like us with various types of ape men. And you could say that this may be continuing even today. It takes you into another controversial topic, evidence for the existence of living ape men. In other words, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, things like that. Takes you into what's called cryptozoology. Now, in terms of the discoveries on Flores Island, there have been many. The first discoveries were those of stone tools that were found in deposits about 800,000 years old. That was a bit of a mystery for archaeologists because they, first of all, had to decide who made the stone tools. Now, according to the current understandings, humans like us did not exist 800,000 years ago. So they would say, well, who made them? Must have been some variety of Homo erectus. Now, it became a question, well then, how did Homo erectus, ape man, get to Flores Island 800,000 years ago, because even 800,000 years ago, it was an island and it was separated from the nearest land by deep sea straits, maybe about 20 miles wide or so. So some archaeologists proposed, well, Homo erectus was more advanced than we thought. He must have made some kind of boat or raft and deliberately sailed across the ocean in order to get to Flores Island. So that was one proposal. I have a different idea. The very first specimen of Homo erectus was found on the island of Java, which is part of Indonesia, in the 1890s by the Dutch researcher Eugene Dubois. He had found a very primitive ape-like skull cap with large brow ridges and a small cranial capacity. And about 45 feet away in his excavation, he found a femur or thigh bone. Actually, several he found, but one of them he immediately published. That was a little bit human-like, and he put the two together and said, okay, this is the missing link, Pithecanthropus erectus, and it later became called Homo erectus. You know, the name was changed. And that's something you can read in any archaeology textbook. What's a little less known is that in the 1970s, some English scientists, Michael Day and T.I. Mollison, restudied the original femur and the other ones that were found but were not published immediately. And they found they were different from any Homo erectus femurs that were discovered after that in Africa and Asia. And they were identical to modern human femurs. So, to me, that indicates that what Dubois actually found in Java in the 1890s was evidence for two types of creatures. Some type of ape man, as represented by the primitive skull cap, but also anatomically modern humans, which were, I propose, the ones who made the sea crossing to Flores Island 800,000 years ago. The deposits in Java where Pithecanthropus were found are about 800,000 years old as well. So I propose that there were two types of hominids existing in Indonesia at that time: anatomically modern humans and some type of Homo erectus sort of creature. Now, the discoveries that you're talking about, Homo Floresiensis, were made in the late 1990s, and they were of a type of Homo erectus, but according to the discoverers, actually they made a new species name for them, but they thought they were descended from, the discoverers thought it was Homo erectus that came 800,000 years ago and then had become dwarfed, because the popular name of what they discovered is called the Hobbit. It helps to have a catchy name in order to get some attention in the media. So, to me, it's not, and that creature existed about 28,000 years ago. In other words, not a long time ago. Long after Homo erectus is supposed to have become extinct or transformed into more modern types of humans. So, to me, where The Hobbit fits in is, I just take it as more evidence that humans like us have coexisted with more primitive ape-like creatures, and there are actual reports from Java and Sumatra and other parts of Indonesia that even today there are little creatures they call Sedaka or something, small men, small forest men, ape men of some kind that are still existing. So where the discoveries would fit in terms of my overall Vedic point of view, more evidence that humans like us have coexisted and may even today be coexisting with more primitive types of humanoid creatures on this planet. Maybe more than some of you wanted to know, but I thought it was a good question and deserved as good an answer as I could give. Any other question? Yes.
You mentioned there's evidence for past lives sort of migrating to the. Is there a more scientific explanation of this phenomenon? Let's say genetic memory.
We can propose different sorts of explanations, but for the researchers who have been involved in this, the most likely incredible explanation is survival of a conscious self. Now, if you were going to have genetic memories, what would the memory be of? Because you've got a lot of ancestors.
At least we have.
In other words, would you get a specific individual memory, just from genetics? And where would it be from? In other words, how would you get it? Because your genes are coming from your mother and your father, really. I mean, it's something I'm willing. I mean, I'm willing to consider things like that. But to me, the most what do you call it in terms of Occam's razor? The most plausible explanation for why a child would spontaneously be reporting detailed memories of a particular individual, which when research turns out that that individual did exist, it would seem to be the most reasonable explanation would be that that conscious self that is now in the body of that child was once in the body of that previously existing individual. Now, there are, if you get into the paranormal realm, there are alternative explanations there, namely that a conscious self somehow or other psychically accesses some memory that's stored in some Akashic record. There's that too. But there are ways to try to discriminate, and even with all of that considered, to me, the idea that it's a survival, that there's a conscious self that has survived from one physical embodiment to the next. See, according to the Vedic epistemology, I mentioned there's the conscious self, the subtle mental body, and then there's the gross physical body. According to the understanding that I have, when we die, the conscious self leaves this body accompanied by the mind, the mental body, the subtle mental body in which memories are stored. And then when that conscious self with its subtle mental body enters its next physical embodiment, some memories are there which some people can access and some people apparently don't, at least not consciously. So that's how I see it. But I'm willing to consider alternatives, alternative explanations. Yes. Yeah, first you,
I wanted to ask about the text that you were reading from the Sanskrit.
yeah.
How precise is the language, and how, I mean, because we have always in the religious text the interpretations, and it's changing over time, and people can find different meaning of it. So how would you say you understand it correctly now? Maybe tomorrow somebody else comes with very different interpretation.
That I'm also willing to consider. However, if, say like we're talking about the time scales, those are set out in multiple texts in language that is very precise. You know, the length of a manvantar, the length of a kalpa, and there is a long tradition of also commentary on these texts from various, you know, disciplic lines that kind of agree. I mean, a typical commentary will look word for word at a text. And, you know, so there's, I mean, the problem that you're talking about is a real one, but for the kinds of information I'm presenting from the text, I think they're reasonable, and they're not, you know, they're from standard readings of text. Now, like